Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's good to be with you on this Wednesday, August 17th, and here's some of what we're talking about tonight. Liz Cheney is preparing to give up her seat in Congress, but she's considering other ways to oppose Donald Trump, even running for president herself. Chuck Todd joins us to unpack yesterday's primary. Rudy Giuliani spent 6 hours today testifying before a grand jury in Georgia. It's part of a criminal probe of efforts to overturn the 2020 election. We'll have more on the investigation. Also, the CDC's director says the agency's fight against COVID included some dramatic mistakes. How will it remake itself to face the next health crisis better? And President Biden sat down with historians to talk about American democracy. NBC's Michael Beschloss was among them. We'll get his take on what was said and what happens now. Let's begin tonight in Wyoming. Yesterday's primary election ended Liz Cheney's bid for another term in Congress. Harriet Hageman won the Republican nomination for Wyoming's only House seat. The state's political composition leans in her favor. GOP voters outnumbered Democrats there, nearly 4-1. Last year, Liz Cheney was the third most powerful Republican in the House. Her political fortunes turned after voting to impeach former President Trump. Based on her concession speech, she stands by that choice.
No office in this land is more important than the principles that we are all sworn to protect. And I well understood the potential political consequences of abiding by my duty. Tonight, Harriet Hageman has received the most votes in this primary. She won. I called her to concede the race. This primary election is over. But now the real work begins.
Her work also continues as the vice chair of the January 6th committee. But once her term ends in January, then what? Savannah Guthrie asked her in an exclusive interview on Today.
Are you thinking about running for president?
That's a decision that I'm going to make in the coming months, Savannah. I'm not going to make any announcements here this morning, but it is something that I'm thinking about, and I'll make a decision in the coming months.
Harriet Hageman won with former President Trump's endorsement. In her victory speech, she took a page out of his playbook.
Wyoming has drawn a line in the sand that if we put you in power, you will be accountable to us, you will answer to us, and you will do what is in our best interests. And if you don't, we will fire you.
And in a statement, Mr. Trump called for Congresswoman Cheney to disappear from politics altogether. Joining us now is NBC political director Chuck Todd, the moderator of Meet the Press. Chuck, I think a lot of people saw Liz Cheney's defeat coming, so it wasn't a shock necessarily, but what does her defeat in this primary tell us?
I just think that it tells us a few things, that in light of a lot of new information that voters got about different issues and character questions and ethical questions about the former president's behavior, in some ways, you could argue reinforcing what Liz Cheney and the investigation she was putting together. None of that had any penetration, and if anything, we see this is a first test in a very red state, but despite what was on paper one of the worst weeks for the president legally, and all of this, that his grip on the party is ever tighter. And the question I have after all of this is, who's going to look at what happened to Liz Cheney and really the 7 other impeachers who voted to impeach and say to themselves, it's good politics for me in the Republican Party to take on Donald Trump? I wonder how many will start to shrink even more when it comes to fighting off, if they want to try to fight off Trump and Trumpism.
Well, let's dig in on that, because I was wondering about that too. Part of me in my, wild-eyed brainstorming brain is like, if I was Liz Cheney's strategist, might I have suggested to her to just let the Trump stuff go, right? Like, you know that people in Wyoming don't dig this. You're still on the January 6th committee. You can do the work. You don't have to die on this hill in the primary. Just like run on your record, try to avoid it. In the general, it might serve you a little better, but like now ain't the time. I don't know if that would have even been possible or if there is even a path for Republicans to walk that line anymore.
Well, it wasn't if you chose to vote to impeach him, right? You know, that when she made that decision, I mean, just we see that he decided, meaning he being Donald Trump, decided that he was going to seek political revenge and attempt to purge the party of critics, whether it was the impeachers or even those that was brought to his attention on just simply being in favor of having a January 6th investigation in committee. He hasn't been as successful targeting some of those Republicans as he has the impeachers. But I think in that sense, I don't know if there was anything Liz Cheney could have done other than not seek re-election. And the question, you know, either way, she has made a decision to fight Trump and Trumpism head on. And look, to do it, you know, she may have to be the one that takes all the arrows in order to, say, plow a field for a Mike Pence to someday be a preferable alternative to Trump and Trumpism. And I use him out there today, not by accident. I thought it was interesting today when he had said he was willing to talk to the January 6th committee, that he would take that very seriously, because I was thinking, boy, he's played it differently than Liz Cheney, though they're on the same side and they're allies in this fight to try to wrestle the Republican Party away from this virus of Trumpism.
Well, and she kind of made it clear in her concession speech that she's not done wrestling. Here is part of what she said.
The great and original champion of our party, Abraham Lincoln, was defeated in elections for the Senate and the House before he won the most important election of all.
She was referring to the long career, and some people, you know, we've heard it on, you know, bumper stickers and T-shirts that Abraham Lincoln lost this election and had a breakdown, and his business failed, and then he became the president. So that you're playing this longer game, and she does have millions of dollars in her war chest. What's the good money on how she's going to spend that money?
I think it's to constantly be a thorn in Donald Trump's side, whatever that means. If it means being a candidate herself, it's a candidate herself. If it's simply constantly reminding Republican primary voters of the things that she believes ought to be front of mind, that she has brought up in this campaign and brought up on the January 6th committee, I mean, her presence will in some ways help Donald Trump in a primary if she happens to run, because it would make the whole thing a referendum on him. And we know in a Republican primary, he will win a referendum on himself in that it's a binary choice of 50-50. But it does real political damage to him over time. And her ultimate goal is to make sure he never goes into the Oval Office again. And she has said that. So I think she's got the ability to essentially be the best funded anti-Trump super PAC inside the Republican presidential primary process, if that's where this is headed.
Let's talk about the candidate who defeated her. Tell us a bit about Harriet Hageman and what we should be looking for going into November in this race.
Well, what's interesting is she was no Trump fan before she decided to essentially convert. And it looks like a story we've seen quite a bit. Here's somebody who has expressed her own reservations about Donald Trump as recently as 2016 in Harriet Hageman. Sort of a Liz Cheney supporter, sort of inside what would be referred to as the mainstream wing of the Wyoming Republican Party. And so I fully expect her to sort of, as you know, to go back to trying to, you know, I don't think she is a Carrie Lake, if you get my drift, who's the Republican nominee in Arizona, who I think sees this opportunity to go even further into using the Trump world to go even further. I think she is going to be satisfied being a member of the Wyoming congressional delegation, and I don't expect her to be a super duper bomb thrower, if you will. Again, not, you know, and there's different types of Republicans that we've seen who have essentially borrowed Trump's political blessing for their own ambition. Some get so taken in by it they want to become him. See Carrie Lake in Arizona. Others simply are looking for a fast path to a political office. And I think Harriet Hageman is going to be somebody that's more closely resembles somebody like that.
Before I got to let you go, Chuck, with regard to the January 6th committee, no more Adam Kinzinger. He's retiring. No more Liz Cheney as of the end of this term. What does that potentially mean for the January 6th committee, if indeed it is even still around and funded, presuming that Republicans don't take power and possibly scuttle the committee? But what could that mean?
Well, regardless of whether Cheney had been reelected or not, if Democrats don't keep control of the House, this version of the January 6th committee will go away. There's been some talk that the House Republicans may do their own version of a January 6th committee, and so we could see that. I think that, I don't want to make predictions on that front, but I think what it means for this January 6th committee, and I don't think it ever really moves their timeline. We still have some hearings in September that I think are going to matter to the story and the investigation, but I do think this should accelerate whatever written report product, as you know, I've been waiting for my version. Give me the Warren Commission paperback. Give me the 9/11 Commission, the Starr Report. We're used to these big government investigations being given to us and the public. Are we going to get this one before Election Day in November? That's always been a question I've had.
Yeah, are we going to get it, and then what will we get in it, and what will the tone be like in terms of the impact on the election on November 8th? Lots and lots of open questions. Thank you, Chuck. That's NBC Political Director Chuck Todd, moderator of Meet the Press, and also of Meet the Press Now, which you can watch here, 4 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, sir.
Meanwhile, in Alaska, NBC News is projecting that its former governor, Sarah Palin, and its current Senator Lisa Murkowski will advance to the November elections. Governor Palin is running for the House seat of the late Congressman Don Young. She could become the first woman to hold that seat. So could one of her opponents, Democrat Mary Peltola, could also become the first Alaska native to represent it in Congress. She seems to have surprised even some of her supporters by taking an early lead over Sarah Palin. Here's NBC political correspondent Ali Vitale.
A lot of decisions for Alaska voters last night and no real results, at least not yet. There were 3 races, though, that caught our attention. We can tick through them just one by one. The first is the one with the most imminent consequences. 3 people here vying to finish the term vacated by the late Congressman Don Young, who passed away in March. That's people like Sarah Palin, Nick Begich, and Mary Peltola, all competing for that seat. No results there yet, and that's not exactly surprising, in part because of the system that was being used here, voters using the ranked choice voting system for the first time, but also because most people in Alaska, just given how big the state is, they vote by mail. It takes some time for those ballots to come in, so we're not expecting results in that race for at least a week, maybe 2. But then what voters were also doing in relation to the House is figuring out what the primary field is going to look like for November. Again, the ranked choice voting system means you are taking very large pools of primary candidates and you have to first whittle them down. So that's what voters also did last night, getting a top 4 field for voters to then choose between again in November. It's a lot of the same names that we already see up for the House seat in the short term, but that's a race that's going to come back around again in November for a full 2-year term. And then, of course, the race that was the true test of what Trump means in Alaska is the Senate primary here. Senator Lisa Murkowski, the only senator who voted to convict Trump of impeachment charges, who's up again in these midterm elections. Both Palin and Murkowski were testing the theory of what Trump's endorsement could mean. Palin hoping it means a whole lot, Murkowski hoping it doesn't mean anything at all, and effectively telling me as much yesterday when she was trying to talk about the role of herself in this Republican Party that has really been remade in Trump's image. As far as Murkowski, though, it was Judgment Day, but not the day that tells us a lot. We expected her to make it to the top 4 in her large primary field, and those 4 candidates are then going to be on the ballot for this Senate contest come November.
That was NBC's Ali Vitale reporting. Still to come, Rudy Giuliani testified before a grand jury today about the 2020 election. What do we know about the criminal investigation in Georgia? We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. A grand jury in Georgia is investigating possible election interference there. Today, it heard testimony from Rudy Giuliani. He and his legal team spent about 6 hours at the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta. We don't know what he said, if he pled the Fifth, or if he claimed attorney-client privilege. We do know that the probe focuses on people who pressured Georgia's election officials to change the 2020 presidential election results. Rudy Giuliani said this the month after Joe Biden won.
I don't have to be a genius to figure out that those votes are not legitimate votes. You don't put legitimate votes under a table.
No.
Wait until you throw the opposition out and in the middle of the night count them. We would have to be fools to think that. So no need to push it any further, but there's more than ample evidence to conclude that this election was a sham.
A few days ago, his attorneys said Mr. Giuliani is a target of the state's criminal investigation. Joining us now is Tamar Hollerman, senior reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's been following the Fulton County election investigation. Ms. Hollerman, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Rudy Giuliani is a witness that the court and that prosecutors have been trying to get to testify for quite some time. Talk about his importance in this investigation.
Yeah, he was involved in several episodes in Georgia that are of interest to this special grand jury. First, he's testified at 3 different hearings before the Georgia legislature in late 2020, in which he spread many falsehoods and conspiracy theories about what he saw as widespread election fraud in Georgia, but was quickly debunked by state authorities. He has called at least one senior member of Georgia political leadership here in Georgia, encouraging him to help call for a special session to reverse Joe Biden's win in Georgia. He was also reportedly at the center of this effort to appoint a slate of alternate Republican electors in Georgia and many other swing states. So, of course, the Fulton County District Attorney has been eager to get Rudy Giuliani to come in to testify before the grand jury. They issued a subpoena for him in early July, and it's taken this long to bring him into the courthouse to testify.
We're looking on the screen now at a timeline of some of the claims in Georgia and all that happened just in the month after the election, starting with meeting with the Trump campaign staff and making this case about widespread fraud, which, to be clear, has never been reliably proven. Soon after that, spreading the conspiracy theory about voting machines and then working with Sidney Powell to lay out those claims in a press conference. December 3rd, Rudy Giuliani told the state Senate about this so-called smoking gun video from the State Farm Arena. And then the next day, Attorney General William Barr told a former U.S. attorney to make that claim a top priority. What exactly is the Fulton County DA focusing on? Is this more than just someone spreading conspiracy theories and saying stuff that isn't true? Like, are they actually trying to go after criminality that could lead to prison time? What is this more or less about?
Sure. So her mandate, the Fulton County DA's, is to look into any attempts to criminally interfere in Georgia's 2020 elections. That's pretty broad, and she can take that in any number of directions. But looking at paperwork that's come out of the DA's office in recent weeks and months, it's really focused in on the concept of a coordinated multi-state effort led by the Trump campaign in order to declare Donald Trump the winner in states where he lost the election. So, of course, she's focused on Georgia here, but it seems like she really is focused on this coordinated aspect. Who might have been at the center of this, directing folks on the ground in Georgia to do things to undermine the election results? And so it makes sense why she'd want to talk to somebody like Rudy Giuliani, who reportedly has been at the center of things like appointing these alternate Republican electors.
And I just want us to be clear. We're not just talking about the impact of somebody making screwy claims on a street corner, right? It would be one thing if he was just saying, like, the flying spaghetti monster stole ballots in Fulton County. But this goes deeper than that. This is not just someone spouting conspiracy theories. This has to do with allegedly what was done as well as what was said, right?
Sure. And I mean, this was somebody with a massive platform. Rudy Giuliani testified 3 times in front of the Georgia legislature. He kind of had a hero's welcome. There was one committee hearing that the grand jury is very interested in, where he spent more than 6 hours. Basically, the floor was turned over to him, and he led in a parade of witnesses who kind of leveled all sorts of falsehoods and half-truths and conspiracy theories that were not true at all. It led to the authoring of a report that was ultimately parroted by the Trump campaign to use as part of their fake elector narrative. And so it kind of all emanates from that and the efforts of the Trump campaign. And the grand jury is interested in talking to about a half dozen lawyers who were allegedly a part of that effort.
The grand jury is also interested in speaking to South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. How does he fit into all of this, and where does that stand?
Sure. Well, he placed 2 phone calls to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger at his office in the aftermath of the November 2020 elections. Now, he was calling to ask about mail-in absentee ballots, but there's a lot of, if not confusion, then dispute about exactly what was being implied by Lindsey Graham during that conversation. In Brad Raffensperger's eyes, Graham was asking him to throw away legally cast ballots in a way that would benefit Donald Trump. Lindsey Graham has argued he's done nothing wrong. He was not implying that. He was simply asking about what the rules were in Georgia, and that it was part of his fact-finding mission as the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and as a senator who was going to vote on the Electoral College votes in the weeks ahead. Lindsey Graham went to federal court in order to quash his subpoena last week. A federal judge on Monday denied that request. She told him he had to appear before the special grand jury this next week. Just a few hours ago, Mr. Graham's lawyers submitted a filing asking for him to not have to go before the grand jury so that he can appeal that ruling to the 11th Circuit.
Tamar Hollerman of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we appreciate you walking us through this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will get to some of today's other top stories in a moment, including the CDC calling for drastic changes to the agency and an $80 billion overhaul at the IRS. Tonight's headlines begin with the CDC. It's planning to learn from its mistakes in dealing with COVID and make changes for the future. Today, its director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, said the agency failed to respond quickly enough to COVID. And as a result, she said it needs an overhaul. She says some of the changes she'd like include a focus on holding itself more accountable, making scientific jargon easier for everyone to understand, and publicizing the CDC's findings and data faster. Joining us now is Catherine Wu, a staff writer at The Atlantic. Her latest piece is called The Pandemic's Soft Closing. Ms. Wu, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Dig in a little more on what Dr. Walensky sees as the most salient areas in regard to the CDC's handling of COVID, where there is the most room for improvement.
Yeah, so this is all coming out of a report that was commissioned in the spring. And, to be clear here, the full report has not yet been released. We should expect to see that in the coming days. But based on briefing documents that were released and reported on today, it seems like Dr. Walensky is acknowledging that her agency did not act quickly enough, nimbly enough. It was not responsive enough to this really quickly evolving crisis. There were issues early on with getting tests out there, with getting accurate tests out there, with getting people access to tests. Throughout the past 2.5 years, the guidance released by the agency has had to change just by nature of the evolving pandemic and our understanding of it. But a lot of that guidance was unnecessarily confusing, and people, even experts, struggle to understand the agency's justification of it. So, a lot of the changes that we would hope to see is faster, more transparent release of data, and probably some issues that, frankly, I haven't yet seen addressed by the CDC.
Issues like what that have not been addressed?
Yeah, so there were definitely some changes proposed here, suggestion of faster release of data, clearer communications. And interestingly, Dr. Walensky seemed to note that her agency was not focused enough on public health and, communicating with the public, which you would expect to be a central tenet of the CDC. The CDC has been criticized for being too academic, too focused on pushing out, for instance, scientific papers rather than making sure that data is getting out to relevant stakeholders as quickly as possible. But a big part of that isn't just, making sure we're putting out any sort of guidance, but What type of guidance? What messaging needs to get out there? It's not just clarity, but the exact message that needs to be clear. Communal benefit, the public and public health. A huge issue throughout this pandemic has been this increasing focus on individualism. Protect yourself, know what your risk is. But what about communal risk? What about the actions we take that benefit not just ourselves, but the people around us who stand to get infected from a virus that can pass from person to person?
I wonder how we put this reform effort, this call from Dr. Walensky to reform, in some kind of context. I mean, there are a lot of agencies in the federal government and in governments whose job it is to relay health information. And during COVID, we had the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar. We had Dr. Deborah Birx, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the president, the vice president was one of the main spokespeople for that initial 30 days to stop the spread way early in the beginning of the pandemic. You know, I mean, the former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, got credit for the way that he talked to New Yorkers about COVID. So where does the blame really lie? If the CDC's always been able to kind of stay in its, bench laboratory research science lane, is there more that we should look at, or is this squarely about the CDC?
Yeah, it's a great question. And certainly this is change that has to probably start with the CDC because they are moving quickly on this. But it really does, I think, hopefully presage change at a more national coordinated scale. I think as you're sort of hinting at here and really aptly pointing out, a lot of the problem comes from getting really different types of information from a bunch of different sources. If my mayor says something different from my governor, says something different from the CDC director, says something different from the president, who am I supposed to listen to? Maybe my aunt who's texting me. I know who she is, and she has advised me wisely before. This is an incredible challenge when communicating during a crisis, when not all of the information is right in front of us all the time. This is also what opens up gaps for misinformation to spread. So ideally, change would come in a very coordinated way. And I think, for better or for worse, this is the kind of thing that is going to take years to execute, especially if we're hoping that everyone is going to come together and ensure that public health is a priority at all the levels that you have mentioned of infrastructure here.
And I just want to also kind of be clear about the nature of what she's talking about. Like we're having the public health conversation with a number of things. COVID, monkeypox right now, that has also been a big public health conversation. It doesn't sound like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it didn't seem like Dr. Walensky was concerned about the core scientific research work of the CDC. They are still an extraordinary organization when it comes to understanding infectious diseases and catching outbreaks. This feels more like it's about the part that you and I encounter as everyday people and not the core capacity to do science, right?
I think that's a fair assessment. The CDC is obviously full of incredibly qualified experts. They produce incredible science that is unparalleled in many respects. But, what use is good science if it's not accurately communicated, if that information is not passed to the people whom it affects? And in a pandemic, that is every single one of us. I think that is a widespread problem with science in general. Often it is so thought about as the process. How are we going to generate this data? How are we going to publish this data? How are we going to sort of gain ourselves credentials? But, where does that science go after that? How is it going to be translated, communicated, and put into good use? How is it going to be operationalized and make sure that it's actually working for everyone as communally as possible? That is the huge challenge here, because obviously we need to meet people where they are, and people are incredibly diverse, obviously, some of whom do not have access to the same resources that others do.
Catherine Wu of The Atlantic, appreciate you making time for us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Another government organization is also looking to make big changes. The IRS. It's getting $80 billion of funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. President Biden signed that law yesterday. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is directing the IRS to brainstorm reforms. She says she wants plans drafted within 6 months. Her priorities include clearing a backlog of unprocessed tax returns, revamping outdated technology, and hiring thousands of new employees. Now, very few people are fans of the IRS, I know, but we need it to collect the taxes that fund the federal government. So tell us, what reforms would you like to see at the IRS? Perhaps you work there or have worked there. What's your view from the inside? Tell us. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. If you are a current employee and you need to keep some information anonymous, you could call us directly at 888-575-2NBC. What needs to be reformed most urgently at the IRS? 888-575-2622 or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. It's been 1 year since the U.S. withdrew armed forces from Afghanistan. That mission killed 13 Americans and injured many more people. At the time, General Frank McKenzie commanded all U.S. troops in the region. How does he reflect on that withdrawal now? He discussed it with our Pentagon correspondent Courtney Cubie in an NBC News exclusive.
It was about a year ago, the end of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. On August 14, 2021, the U.S. began a non-combatant evacuation operation as Taliban fighters surrounded the capital, Kabul. The next 2 weeks proved chaotic and deadly.
I felt very strongly that we had the ability to keep a platform in Afghanistan at about 2,500.
Critics said any U.S. presence would put the U.S. back at war with the Taliban and require thousands more troops to deploy. But General Frank McKenzie, who commanded all the troops in the region at the time, says the withdrawal could have turned out differently.
I would have preferred to hold Bagram at 2,500, but that's what it would have taken, and that would also assume the Afghans would stand and fight with you, and we thought the Afghans would stand and fight with us at 2,500.
President Biden ordered all U.S. troops to leave, a decision the administration defends even today.
As for the argument about troops on the ground, I mean, we've heard from other defense leaders as well that had we kept that number or a large number of troops on the ground after May, and of course the president extended that to August, we would have found ourselves at war with the Taliban, and American troops would have come under attack again, which means that it would have been very likely that we would have had to add to the 2,500 troops that were already there. And that was just unacceptable to the president, that we weren't going to not only add troops, but that we were going to stay at war indefinitely with the Taliban.
McKenzie still believes it was doomed from the start.
I think we wanted to have it all. We wanted to withdraw and essentially go to zero and yet maintain a diplomatic platform in the country, and that was not feasible. And so that's why we got ourselves into an extremist situation at the very end.
1 year ago today, McKenzie was at Kabul airport, the front line of the evacuation.
It was a surreal scene. You had human waste all over the deck, partially eaten food, water bottles. The possibility of attack was very, very real.
But he believes the chaos was inevitable once the U.S. announced the decision to withdraw.
I believe that what happened in August of last year occurred when we decided to leave completely in April of that year. And once you make that basic decision, then events took on a certain trajectory. That's not a military decision, that's a political decision.
McKenzie believes the military alone shouldn't take the blame.
I think the U.S. failure in Afghanistan was not the failure solely of the U.S. military, although we certainly bear responsibility for that, but a whole of government approach that simply failed.
The events of last summer still haunt Frank McKenzie.
I've thought about it every day. It's something that I spent a lot of time considering. The lost opportunities, what it meant, the loss of human beings.
What were some of the lost opportunities that you still think about now?
I think about what we could have done differently, and I owe that to those who did not come home. Not only those who did not come home from what happened in August, but those that preceded them in our 20-year engagement in Afghanistan, because those lives are very valuable too.
That was NBC Pentagon correspondent Courtney Cubie reporting. Coming up, a historical view of democracy's future. President Biden invited historians to talk about the challenges America faces. One of them was NBC presidential historian Michael Beschloss. He joins us just ahead. Stay close. How's American democracy looking to you these days? Depending on who you ask, its institutions are in some shaky spots right now. Today, former Vice President Mike Pence spoke in New Hampshire. He acknowledged the growing threats to federal officials after the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago. Mr. Pence had a message for his fellow Republicans.
We can hold the Attorney General accountable for the decision that he made without attacking rank and file law enforcement personnel at the FBI. The Republican Party is the party of law and order. Our party stands with the men and women who serve on the thin blue line at the federal and state and local level. And these attacks on the FBI must stop.
Last week, a Homeland Security bulletin warned of violence against federal officials, the likes of which we've never seen on this scale. The bulletin mentioned last week's attack on the FBI field office in Cincinnati. The suspect, Ricky Schiffer, died during a confrontation with police. He appeared to have recently posted online about his desire to kill FBI agents. It has been said that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. When it comes to open threats on the rule of law, to concerns over the survival of our democracy. Have we heard this song before? According to the Washington Post, last week, President Biden discussed this with a group of academics. Some comparisons were reportedly made to America before the Civil War and to pro-fascist movements before World War II. So what lens should we view all this through? And what should we do about what we see? Let's get into that with NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. He was part of the group that met with the president. Always good to see you, Michael. And first of all, I wonder if you could just set the scene for us. And good to see you. And set the scene for us and let us know as much as you can about the meeting with the president. What was the tone like? What was the president's expectation for that conversation?
Thanks. Wonderful to see you as always, Joshua. Here's a case where President Biden asked about 4 outside historians, including myself, to come in and talk about what in 2022, in this month, reminds us of something in history. And it didn't take us very long for most of us to say that it reminded us particularly of 2 moments in American history, which you mentioned. One, 1859 and 1860, just before the Civil War, when the issue of slavery was dividing this country down the middle, and we were in danger of mass violence, which of course did erupt in a civil war that took 4 to 5 years. And the other time, I think perhaps less well known, is the 1930s, a time when there was a Great Depression, a lot of people were out of work, but also fascism was on the march around the world. Italy, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan. And many people in the United States not only thought that freedom was not going to be very long to live in our country, but maybe an authoritarian system would be better, some thought. There were people like Father Charles Coughlin of Detroit, who spoke to 30 million people on the radio every weekend, which was a large number, especially in those days, and others who said maybe we're better off with a dictator. Once again, the specter of violence. The main thread through all of this, Joshua, is that we've gone through moments like this, but the country in the end unites and settles its problems. I hope to God that happens this time.
With regard to this comparison, I wonder how deep that goes and where the comparison breaks. I mean, at least, with the Civil War, there was a very clear act of violence. Abraham Lincoln becomes president. The Confederacy attacks Fort Sumter in South Carolina. They fired the first shot. So we knew something had changed. There was this rising up of pro-fascist sentiment in the U.S., that huge rally at Madison Square Garden in New York in 1939. All these pro-German fascists who held this huge event and had Nazi banners next to George Washington's picture.
Totally Nazi.
Like, we had and we had a clear image, right? We had a very clear picture as like, okay, that's it. Was January 6th on that par, or are we still looking for something that is much more egregious to make that comparison airtight?
Oh, I think, well, number one, January 6th could have very quickly led to mass rebellion, to Donald Trump saying, I have to stay in office because I have to declare martial law to make the country safe. All that could have happened. And it could happen again today, not the martial law part necessarily, but unlike 1860, unlike the 1930s, people who want to engage in this kind of violence, who want to attack the federal government, they've got access to social media. So unlike those earlier times, they can communicate with one another instantly. They can inflame one another. They can organize uprisings all over this country. That wasn't possible earlier in our history, and so therefore we have to take it gravely seriously. Let
me ask about the counteraction to that, though. I mean, when we're talking about 1939, the prelude to World War II. 1860, the beginning of the Civil War. That had to be solved ultimately through violence. I tend to be rooting for the good guys. I never talk about my politics, but you're damn right I'm a proud American and I'm rooting for democracy. And I feel like there's a difference now. You're damn right. And I feel like there's a difference now in terms of the role, you mentioned Father Coughlin, that the media plays, especially because, everyone's a publisher now. And I wonder how you see that. I'm not sure how to put the context of messaging and propaganda and misinformation and disinformation, or even institutions like this one, and how we factor into keeping the country knit together.
Well, here's the difference. In 1860, let's say, or the late 1930s, if there was a wild conspiracy theory, it probably would be handed out in a pamphlet by someone mumbling to himself on a street corner in some city. Wouldn't have a large circulation. Now, because of the internet, those conspiracy theories instantly get audiences of billions of people. And therefore, you've got situations like, what percentage of Americans right now think that Donald Trump really won the election of 2020? What percentage of Americans wrongly thought that Barack Obama was not a Christian but a Muslim? What number of Americans thought that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11? Those wild, false conspiracy theories, I would argue, would never have had the traction and the audience they did, except for the fact that the internet now exists, and the same audience of billions of people can be handed to some crazy person on the street corner as would be handed to a reputable news organization.
One more thing I want to ask you in terms of solutions. Abraham Lincoln once said, with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. What might work? What might history tell us about ways to turn public sentiment away from some of these kind of anti-democratic impulses and keep the country as tightly woven together as we can? What might work?
What history shows us is the best thing we can hope for is a president and a Congress that really attacks basic problems. That's what happened with Abraham Lincoln. It was a bloody civil war, but he finally got an amendment to outlaw slavery and deal with some of the other problems that had festered for almost a century. Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s first reduced unemployment, got the country out of the Great Depression, and then he said, we've got to fight the fascists around the world. So what the formula would be is if we have President Biden passing some legislation of the kind that I think we've seen in the last 2 weeks, and those policies begin to work and people feel better about the federal government, you'll see less antagonism.
NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss, rooting for democracy. Much appreciated, my friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful to see you, my friend.
Last night, we told you about the NBA's decision to not play on this election day. All 30 teams will play the day before as part of a civic engagement night to encourage voter turnout. A number of you shared your thoughts on the league's decision. Pearl Girl tweeted, "Thanks, NBA, for choosing not to hold games on Election Day. Thanks for the backbone and for standing up for democracy. Shame on the rest of the world's organizations." And Julian wrote on Facebook, "I feel that it's probably the best decision the league has made. Voting is probably one of the most precious rights we have as Americans. Voting dictates how our democracy will be moving forward. I believe all professional sports leagues that are running a schedule around Election Day should not run any sporting events on that day." Thank you both for sharing your perspective with us, and we'll see what other pro sports leagues choose to do on November 8th. Schools are getting back in session, but some families are not sending their children back. More parents of color are choosing to homeschool their kids. Our special series, Kids Under Pressure, before we go. Now to our special series, Kids Under Pressure, about the many pressures families are facing today. Schools are reopening, summer is just about over, and vaccines are becoming widely available. More children can get them now, too. Still, a growing number of black parents are choosing to homeschool their children. Some families who are making that choice shared their stories with NBC's Antonia Hilton.
may look like a simple summer outing, but these kids are at Terhune Orchards in New Jersey for a full day of school lessons about plants and animals. They are the Melanin Village, a collective of black families that have decided to homeschool, many driven away from public schools after the pandemic exposed inequities.
Do you want to go to regular school?
No.
Not one person.
For a whole entire day, no.
Before COVID, only 3% of black students were homeschooled. In 2021, it shot up to 16%.
And once you do it,
Brene Fairchild says many aren't going back.
When did you decide that this is what you wanted for your kids?
I looked at the presentation of slavery and the Civil War in U.S. history textbooks. It's not accurate. It's not honoring to the African American experience.
Fairchild founded the Melanin Village to share school materials and organize group activities with families like hers. They've served over 450 families since 2020. Thousands attend their conferences. Village parents were fed up with schools that had few teachers that looked like their kids. Many offended as districts struggled to teach about race. And at least 36 states passed or proposed laws to restrict those conversations in school.
When you look at the state of schools right now, are black kids being served?
Our current system is not designed in a way to serve black children.
In Detroit, Bernita Bradley says her homeschooling group, Engage Detroit, has 98 families with 20 more expected to join this fall. They include Sharice Powell, whose 14-year-old Tori needs extra support.
These black families are starting to realize, I don't think this is the best situation.
We don't have times when you've seen generations after generations fail. Mm-hmm. We don't have time to keep waiting.
Victoria Bradley says she was being bullied relentlessly in Detroit schools. At 15, she asked her mom, Bernita, to take her out.
When you transitioned to homeschooling, how did you start to feel about yourself?
I felt more confident. It was just like kind of like a sunshine, like the clouds opening a little bit.
Homeschoolers hope that their groups inspire schools to get creative and ensure they are welcoming all kinds of learners.
Do you think the schools are going to listen? I mean, the system, does it see what's happening?
I think on individual scales that yes, that there are schools who will. Now, if we're talking about the system overall, I think that gets into things that are a bit deeper. I don't want my child to be the guinea pig in the midst of us still figuring this out. No.
Antonia Hilton joins us now. Antonia, I got to say, the mom you talked to from Jersey reminds me of my mom very, very much. She was a career educator, always made sure I had after-school enrichment, summer school programs, like all of those enrichment programs. That was very much a part of my upbringing, but I still went to traditional school as well. How are these parents thinking through the future of their kids going to any kind of traditional schooling? Are they giving up on brick and mortar schools, or is this just kind of augmenting a conventional education?
It's both. For every family, it's a little different. That family that you just mentioned there in New Jersey, they're pretty sure they're not going back into traditional schools. But then some of the other families that I spoke to who were there with us at the farm that day, they said they were open to it. That maybe as their kid gets closer to middle school or high school, that bringing them back into the public schools, that might work for them. Because, the reason some families stepped away, they're very much interconnected, but they kind of take on a different look in each family. And so for some of the folks we talked to, right, it was about their child's confidence. They were the only black kid in class. They felt lonely. They didn't feel included. And so being part of something like the Melanin Village has actually increased their confidence. And their parents are waiting for that right moment to maybe bring them back into the school system once they feel like their confidence is really up there. And then there are other students like the girl Victoria, who we mentioned, who was relieved to be permanently out of the public school system. And her grades shot up the moment she was back at home, Joshua.
What are some of the challenges they face as they shift from brick and mortar school to homeschool? I can imagine that, getting used to dealing with curricular standards, any other kind of state standardized test requirements, and then just the logistics, especially if everyone's working.
It's a lot. Well, cost is probably the first concern because it can cost several hundred or even a couple $1,000s to just get your hands on the materials to start doing this. I mean, everyone knows how much textbooks cost, and you have to get some of your own testing programs. You need to buy all these class materials, make sure you have all these books at your home. And so that's part of the collective's purpose, right? It's not just friends and people to go out and do lessons with. It's also to share materials so that it's less costly for the group or each individual in the group. The other major hiccup that most families describe to me is first really learning how to become a teacher yourself. identifying what kind of teaching methods your kids really respond to. And there's often, what I hear from families, a sort of trial and error period where they try some types of lessons, it doesn't work. They find something eventually that does work well, and then they see their kids' engagement with school and their grades really soar from there. And then, of course, there are occasionally families for whom this doesn't work. But in terms of what we've found and the researchers that we've spoken to, the vast majority of the families feel like they saw vast improvements in their kids' performances, their kids' experiences after trying this.
I'm so fascinated by this, and I'll be interested to see how these families reflect on their decision to homeschool in the future. Thank you, Antonia. That's NBC's Antonia Hilton with yet another fascinating story that I am dying to hear from you about. Feel free to send us your thoughts, your questions on this. Maybe you are a homeschool parent of color, or if you have thoughts on the NBA's plans for Election Day, or the future of the IRS, or anything we've covered tonight. We're at NBC Now Tonight on social media. Leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for making time for us. Good night.